you can pass without having any problem. Sometimes sometimes in talking in English, you know, you have some different problems, but in Little Havana, you don't have any problem. Everybody talks Spanish, and you can be almost like in Havana.
The Cuban representatives, who maintained a low profile during their 5-day stay here, left for Atlanta this morning. They're planning a nationwide campaign next year to attract tourist dollars to their financially troubled nation. Bill Urbizu, Newswatch 10. The picking season, as many as 20,000 illegal aliens hide out and work here in South Dade, earning below standard wages. It's the U.S. Border Patrol's job to seek them out, arrest, and extradite them. Understaffed, the Border Patrol is waging a losing war. At 6 a.m., acting on a tip, agents surrounded an apartment complex at Southwest 137th Avenue and 265th Street.
Hablo fuerte, somos de migración.
After identifying themselves in Spanish as immigration officers, a weary-eyed occupant opened the door. He indicated there was no one outside. Agents searched and found 4 men hiding in a closet. 5 more men were found in this nearby apartment. Some were sleeping on mattresses on the floor. For these illegal aliens who work in the migrant labor fields of Homestead, this is all they can afford. Their arrest came about after neighbors complained of the unsanitary conditions and overcrowding.
We received information from the Dade County Health Department about some of the conditions that exist here, and so the information was sent to labor compliance officers, and they in turn called us, and we worked the information this morning.
Are these the typical conditions under which you make these arrests?
Yes, I would say it's typical. They live 5, 6, 7 in a room, and and some of them sleep in mattresses on the floor. It's very unsanitary conditions.
These are among the more than 100,000 illegal aliens who enter Florida each year. Incredibly, there are only 20 Border Patrol agents in the entire state to control the influx. This morning's arrest is considered a drop in the bucket. The problems are mind-boggling. Solutions have not been found. Here's an example. 41-year-old Juanciano Garcia crossed the Rio Grande into Texas 2 years ago, leaving behind his wife and 9 children. They survive on the few dollars he manages to send them. Garcia and his 9 companions are going home now, but agents are certain he and thousands others like him will be back. Bill Urbizu, Newswatch 10, Homestead.
Culture and intended to the Cuban community for much of that enrichment. Bill Urbizu visits a symphony conductor in another Newswatch special report, Up Close.
Conducting a symphony orchestra is a passionate and demanding art. For 22 years, Alberto Fajardo has faced the creative challenges and met them to the acclaim of critics throughout the United States and Latin America. Born in Cuba 56 years ago, he began playing second violin in the Havana Philharmonic in 1943. 14 years later, he was named director of that orchestra. In 1961, he fled from communism and soon became the first Cuban exile to conduct the Baltimore Symphony. He has since conducted symphony orchestras in Mexico, Washington, and Miami, among others. Now in rehearsal for Pagliacci, he directs with forceful determination, demanding perfection. He is temperamental and at times impatient.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yes. 1.
When I conducting, I feel a beautiful groove of emotion. Frustration, anger, satisfaction, fulfillment, happiness. When I listen, the audience understand what the orchestra and I are doing. I am very happy when I have the baton in my hand, and doesn't matter it's a small orchestra or big orchestra or a small opera, doesn't matter. I do my job with a gran felicidad, with a great intention with a more beautiful method that I can use.
Maestro Fajardo says he has no ambitions to be a globe-trotting symphony conductor. His true calling is to continue providing good music to his community. That, he says, is as satisfying as reaching musical perfection. Newswatch 10.
Fidel Castro held out an olive branch of sorts to Cuban exiles in a freewheeling conference with reporters in Havana last night. Newswatch's Bill Urbizu, a Cuban exile himself, says Castro did not go as far as was hoped on the question of exiles returning or on the release of 1,000 political prisoners.
Castro met with newsmen last night in a conference room steps away from his office in the presidential palace on Havana's Revolutionary Square. For the first time, Cuban exiles were among 25 foreign correspondents from 6 nations. We questioned the Cuban leader for more than 3 hours on wide-ranging topics. There was hope Castro would shed more light on his recent decision to free 1,000 political prisoners, allow dual nationals and their families to leave, and announce what government officials were promoting as a significant change of policy regarding Cuban exiles.
When do you feel Cuban exiles will be allowed to return to their homeland and be reunited with their families?
Bueno, yo creo que eso forma parte
Well, I think that forms part
del grupo de problemas que le pueden interesar a la comunidad cubana
of the
en el
series of
exterior.
problems that might interest the Cuban community over there.
Forma parte de los problemas sobre los cuales se pueden pensar,
It is part of the problems on
se
which we can
pueden
think about,
analizar
which we
y
can
se pueden
analyze,
discutir,
and which we can discuss,
pero sobre los cuales realmente no hay una decisión todavía.
but on which actually no decision has been made as yet.
Nosotros estamos dispuestos a discutir, conversar.
We are willing to
quiera.
discuss, to talk.
Estas cuestiones que le interesan a la comunidad
These
cubana,
matters that the Cuban community is interested in
con la comunidad cubana,
with the Cuban community,
pero no con el gobierno de Estados Unidos.
but not with the government of the United States.
Pero son problemas a analizar, a discutir.
But these are problems that will have to be
Yo
analyzed,
puedo
will have to be
expresar
discussed.
nuestra disposición
I can express our willingness
a discutir con la comunidad cubana
to discuss with the Cuban community
estos problemas.
these problems.
Castro said he intended to free the 1,000 political prisoners in coming weeks, but refused to identify any of them, saying he did not want to pressure Washington to accept them. He indicated he expected no reciprocal action from Washington as a result of his gestures.
Ahora, en realidad nosotros no esperamos
But actually,
ninguna respuesta del gobierno de Estados Unidos.
we do not expect any response from the government of the United States.
En lo, bueno, en lo relativo a la cuestión de los ciudadanos norteamericanos,
Regarding the North American citizens,
o supuestamente de doble nacionalidad,
or supposedly dual nationality,
yo diría que fue en parte una respuesta nuestra
I would say that
a los cambios de
partially
actitud del gobierno de Estados
it
Unidos.
was a response of ours to the change of stance on the part of the U.S. government.
En lo que se refiere a los cubanos,
Regarding the Cubans,
ninguno de estos problemas se ha discutido con el gobierno de Estados Unidos.
none of these problems have been discussed with the government of the United States.
El gobierno de Estados Unidos no tiene absolutamente nada que ver con
The
eso.
government of the United States has absolutely nothing to do with this.
Castro told newsmen 3,000 political prisoners still remain behind bars. He expressed willingness, however, to negotiate their release with representative members of the exile community, mentioning only one by name, Hialeah Minister Reverend Manuel Espinosa. Castro attributed his decision to establish talks with the exile community on what he termed changing attitudes.
Yo creo que se ha ido produciendo un cierto cambio de actitud.
I think that a certain change in attitude has taken place.
tanto en la masa de la comunidad cubana en el exterior,
among the masses of Cubans abroad,
como en la propia opinión de
as well as
nuestro pueblo
the views of our people
y de la revolución en general.
and of the revolution in general.
Yo pienso que ha habido un
I feel that
descenso de hostilidad.
there has been a decrease of hostility.
La revolución va a cumplir 20 años.
The revolution will celebrate its 20th anniversary.
Desde nuestro punto de vista,
From our point of view,
está absolutamente consolidado.
it is absolutely consolidated.
Es irreversible.
It is irreversible.
Eso lo sabemos nosotros.
That we know.
Lo sabe el gobierno de Estados Unidos.
The U.S. government knows also.
Y yo creo que lo sabe también la comunidad cubana.
And I think that the Cuban community abroad knows that also.
Castro described U.S.-Cuban relations at a stalemate. He will not, he says, negotiate Cuba's role in Africa. He hopes relations will improve, but warns that will never materialize until the Carter administration lifts the economic embargo imposed on Cuba. The expected announcement of a change of policy regarding Cuban exiles never fully materialized. However, Castro's willingness for the first time ever to sit down with representative members of the Cuban exile community and discuss such issues as the release of more political prisoners and the reunification of Cuban families is viewed as a cautious but significant step. Bill Urbizu, Newswatch 10, Havana.
Ranks Fidel Castro's intentions to release some political prisoners in Cuba. That was among the subjects Castro discussed with Cuban exile reporters in a rare Havana news conference this week. While Newswatch reporter Bill Urbizu was in Havana, Cuban officials permitted him an exclusive interview with Dr. Santiago Echemendia, one of the several prisoners who might be released. Here's Bill's report.
Dr. Santiago Echemendia now walks freely along Havana's famed Malecon. A month ago, that would have been unimaginable. Yesterday, the Cuban government officially commuted his sentence, ending 17.5 years of incarceration, most of which was spent at hard labor. In the 1950s, Echemendia took part in a student revolt to overthrow the Batista regime. He supported the revolution and its rise to power, but turned against it when he learned of its communist leanings. He joined a counter-revolutionary group headed by Manuel Artime and guided by the CIA, which carried out acts of sabotage and plotted to assassinate Fidel Castro. He was arrested in 1961, convicted and sentenced to 20 years. He has since spent his years going from one prison to the other: El Príncipe, Isle of Pines, Guanajay, and the infamous La Cabaña. For the past 6 years, he had been in a special rehabilitation program, allowing him to be a practicing physician in jail. Although he took part in the program, Echemendia emphasized his political convictions had not changed. The first years of his incarceration, he told me, were the harshest. I asked Echemendia to comment on his impending release.
Mi reacción es la posibilidad de unirme a mi familia.
My reaction is the possibility of reuniting with my family, and my wife and son have been separated from me since 1965. You must understand, my wife has suffered enough. It's very difficult to understand the conditions in Cuba. The only contact we have had is through letters. My son has grown into manhood. He is studying medicine. I practically don't know him. He doesn't know me. I fundamentally want to begin a new life, which is what we all want. It has been a very long incarceration, where lives have been affected, professions have been cut off, studies have been discontinued, families have been destroyed due to the long separation, the long time we have been separated. And so, we want to resolve our problems. The problems, hopes, and anxieties expressed by Dr. Echemendia are shared by his wife, Carmen, and his 16-year-old Santiago, who live in Miami. This afternoon, we showed them the taped interview. It was the first opportunity Santiago has had to see and hear his father since the age of 4, when he last visited him in jail. He's shorter than I thought, he remarked. He's not as thin as we had been told, said Carmen. They refused any further comments, fearing it may hurt Dr. Echemendia's chances of leaving Cuba for the United States. So many things have happened, she said, so much suffering and false hopes. For 17 years, the Echemendias have shared a common nightmare with thousands of other Cuban families. They now hope to be awakened from it one day soon. Bill Urbizu, Newswatch 10.
Airlines charter jet at Miami International Airport marks the first time in more than 12 years that persons holding both Cuban and American citizenships have been allowed by Fidel Castro to leave the communist island.
64 dual nationals and their 68 family members arrived on this first flight. It was a mixed group, ranging from the very young to the very old. Their presence here is proof of Castro's increasing efforts to improve diplomatic relations with the United States. The process began last June when the Cuban leader told visiting congressmen he would allow all dual nationals and their families to leave. New York Congressman Stephen Solars, who arrived with the group, says he will ask President Carter to take reciprocal action. Anxious families waited outside U.S. Customs. Manuel and Elaine Quintero came to be reunited with their 3 sons, who they've not seen since 1967. For them and other families, their long years of separation were finally over. After their tearful reunions, the passengers were taken to waiting buses for their ride to the Columbus Hotel. Their divided families got to know each other once again. Their dream had finally materialized.
I can tell you, it's like a dream. I tried to come here since 10 years ago, but now I'm here.
I feel very happy to stay here, and I think my life becomes a new life.
Well, you can imagine, I've been waiting for almost 14 years to come over, so when I knew that I was coming up, I just jumped like a frog.
The new arrivals will remain at the hotel until housing and financial assistance is provided through the federally funded American Repatriated Program.
This reunion is only the first of many more to come. There are about 400 dual nationals and their 700 Cuban dependents still waiting to leave Cuba. The next group is expected to arrive on October 4th. Newswatch Columbus Hotel in downtown Miami.
Bizu has found one man steeped in both traditions. Here's a look at the man and his work up close.
Fernando Rivero is a lucky and contented man. For more than 30 years, he has made a living doing what he loves best, making guitars. The Cuban-born craftsman has defied mass production lines and passed up the fast bucks. Instead, he has chosen to work by himself in a small workshop in his backyard. Rivero works at his own pace, using his skilled hands. It is more than just a job for him. It is a labor of love and art. Although his many clients may have to wait several weeks for the finished product, all agree the wait is well worth it.
These days, the guitar is very cheap because the factory makes so many guitars, and the people don't think about the quality. The guitar that you can buy is the handmade guitar because it's the best quality, and the people that handmade guitar put in everything, your heart, your soul, and feel because it's on part of his life. For me, my guitar is more than a profession. It's the art, you know, because every people that makes something with the hand, the mind, and the heart is a pure art.
Rivero, who learned his unique craft from his father, has now passed on those skills to his son. The chain of tradition remains unbroken. His dying art has been saved. But a skeptical Fernando Rivero wonders, for how long? Bill Urbizu, Newswatch 10.
Rule says he might release more political prisoners by the end of this year. In a historical move, 46 Cuban political prisoners and their families were allowed to immigrate to the United States yesterday, the first group in almost 16 years. Newswatch reporter Bill Urbizu accompanied the group from incarceration to freedom.
It was an unprecedented day. newsmen were allowed to visit and film inside a Cuban prison. It was the first time this had ever happened since Fidel Castro came to power almost 2 decades ago. The site was the Combinado de Este, Cuba's newest prison. It houses 4,000 prisoners, 1,000 of which are incarcerated for their dissenting political convictions. These 42 men are among the 1,000. Many have been behind bars for more than 15 years. Their anguished faces bear proof of the long years of hopeless confinement. A 6-member Cuban exile delegation, headed by Miami Bank executive Dr. Bernardo Benes, came to give them hope. Benes told them they would not be forgotten and committed himself and his delegation to work feverishly to secure their release. During breakfast, newsmen were allowed to talk with the inmates. 48-year-old Domingo Sanchez has been in prison for 17 years, 9 months, and 16 days. Arrested during the Escambray uprising against Castro, he now counts the days remaining on his 20-year sentence. All he longs for is to be with his wife, 3 sons, and 2 grandchildren. Juan Caballero Montero has served 14 years of his 20-year sentence for plotting to assassinate Castro. Caballero told me he is optimistic future negotiating talks between exiles and the Cuban government will result in his freedom. He expressed disgust at what he termed reactionary groups in exile who are against the negotiations. They have been living at our expense for too long, he said. It is time for them to dedicate themselves to our cause. That cause was the theme of 2 meetings held yesterday afternoon between Castro and the exile delegation. Both sides talked with newsmen after their last meeting in a plush home in Cubanacan, a suburb of Havana. Benes said a pre-agenda to be used in future negotiating talks was presented to the Cuban leader, who agreed to it without objections. Castro told newsmen he allowed the first group of political prisoners to leave the island in recognition of the Cuban community abroad, and added he expected no concessions in return. Since his invitation to hold negotiating talks last month, he said his government had received many requests from exiles wishing to participate in the talks. He would welcome, he said, the formation of a representative committee, numbering as many as 50 members, to take part in the negotiations. The talks, he emphasized, could begin immediately. The problems, he hoped, would be resolved by the end of the year. For 46 political prisoners and their 33 family members aboard the Eastern Airlines charter jet bound for Miami, those problems were finally resolved. They were the first group of prisoners allowed to leave Cuba since 1962. But the Bay of Pigs veterans were ransomed in exchange for $53 million in food and medicine. Among those aboard was Tony Cuesta, who lost his sight and one arm in 1966 during an attempt to break Cuba. Cuesta says he will work to seek the release of his companions left behind. Dr. Santiago Chimendia has spent the longest time behind bars than any other prisoner in the group, 17 years. Within minutes, he would be reunited with his wife and only son, which he has not seen since the age of 4. He, too, is concerned of his fellow inmates still in jail. Applauses greeted them on their arrival at Miami International Airport. Waiting buses drove them to the Dade County Auditorium. There, an estimated 3,500 exiles, made up of relatives, friends, and admirers, gave them an emotional reception. Despite pleas to be calm, hundreds pressed forward, outstretching their arms. Sighting relatives, they cried out. Dr. Echemendia's long years of separation were finally over. His dream and that of 45 other prisoners had come true. They were reunited in freedom. Bill Urbizu, Newswatch Town.
To Havana with the Benes Committee, and he talked to many of the men still behind bars. Here's his Newswatch Extra.
This is the Combinado de Este, Cuba's newest prison. It's home for 4,000 prisoners, 1,000 of which have been labeled political. Our visit here marks the first time since Fidel Castro came to power almost 20 years ago that newsmen have been allowed to visit and film within Cuban prison walls. The occasion was the unprecedented visit of a 6-member Cuban exile delegation which came to give prisoners hope.
hoped that one day soon, through negotiations with the Cuban government, they would be set free. Many have spent more than 15 years in jail because of their dissenting political convictions. During an early morning breakfast meeting, we were allowed to talk with them. Most accepted and took part in the prison's rehabilitation work program. Prison officials and guards are able to distinguish them from other inmates by the gray uniform they wear. Those who refuse rehabilitation wear yellow. They are called plantados. Pedro Martinez Fraga is one of them. So is Carlos Garcia. Both men have been behind bars for 17 years, condemned for counter-revolutionary activities. Fraga expressed frustration at the news that some exiles were against negotiating with the Cuban government his release and that of his companions. Talking, he says, is not giving in.
To state our position, I would say that for many years we've been dialoguing with the authorities here without losing our way of thinking, without damaging our principles and values. We have stood up to many pressures and different attitudes from the government, its regime, and we have dialogued through the years with them, sometimes asking, sometimes demanding, sometimes rejecting, and I don't think it's changed any our way of thinking or principles. So it surprised us a little, or perhaps a little more than I could put into words, to find that some people are, how should I say, against this dialogue or against the possibility of talking to the government as if they would lose their values or as if their thoughts or convictions would be changed.
I think if I am a prisoner right now, I can talk too much. I can give any real opinion about that matter. I like that all the prisoners will be released in a short time, but in a jail now, you can approve or disapprove the dialogue.
One man who is against the dialogue is Eloy Gutierrez Menoyo, one of the most famous of Cuban political prisoners. Menoyo fought against Batista alongside Castro and later turned against him when he learned of Castro's tiny schemes. He came to Miami in 1961, founded Alpha 66, and led a series of commando raids in Cuba. In 1965, he was arrested and sentenced to 30 years in prison. 4 years ago, he was sentenced to an additional 25 years for conspiring against the state while in prison. He told me there was no need for dialogue. Castro could release all political prisoners tomorrow if he really wanted to. First, the one that has the freedom of prisoners in its hands is Castro's government. In Chile, for example, they have freed prisoners. The exile community, however, was not summoned to seek their release. Simply, the government agreed to release them. Secondly, the reunification of families is something that is correct and necessary. There have been too many years of separation. No one opposes reunification of families, but it does not require a dialogue. Simply an announcement by the government that says from this day on, persons wishing to enter and leave may do so. It does not require dialogue. Now, there is a third point that does require dialogue, and it's one that should be asked. What about freedom in Cuba? Freedom to move, to express, to write, to teach. A series of questions that do require dialogue. I fought previously against Batista's dictatorship. Based on that same principle, I have the right to oppose and to have an opinion in this country. And when these rights were suppressed, I had to confront the present government. Now, the question I ask you, have these conditions ceased in Cuba? Have an opinion? Are there liberties in Cuba? Well, if you were to converse on these issues, then without a doubt, I would tell you I am in favor of the dialogue. But as to point 1 and 2, I simply believe it is common humanity. It does not require dialogue. Menoyo added he is mentally conditioned to remain in jail until his unconditional release. Just when that release will take place for him and 3,000 other political prisoners remains uncertain. All they can do now is to wait, pray, and hope their long years of tormenting confinement will finally come to an end. Bill Urbizu, Newswatch 10, Cuba.
Cuban prisons are still filled with political prisoners serving long sentences for anti-revolutionary views. In a surprising turnaround, the Cuban government permitted reporters inside one prison to talk with the dissidents. Newswatch reporter Bill Urbizu says their families here reacted with emotion to the taped interviews.
Saturday morning, Combinado de Este, Cuba's newest prison. In an unprecedented move, reporters are allowed to talk with 42 inmates. Most of them wore gray uniforms, the color of those who have chosen to participate in the prison's rehabilitation work program. I spoke to two men who refused to be rehabilitated. They wear distinguishing yellow uniforms. They are called plantados. Pedro Martinez Fraga is one of them. So is Raul Granados Gonzalez. Granados has been in jail for 13 years. Martinez, 17, both convicted for counter-revolutionary activities. Both men expressed hope the Cuban exile delegation would secure their release through negotiations with the Cuban government. Those sentiments were echoed by their family members in Miami today. We showed them a taped interview. It was the first opportunity the Martinez children have ever had to see and hear their father. It was a moving and emotional moment. The eldest, 20-year-old Ana Julieta, was only 3 when her father was incarcerated. Pedro was a year old. Maria Eugenia was born shortly after his arrest. Mrs. Martinez has been separated from her husband since 1961. Granado's daughter, Thais, vaguely remembers her father. She was only 5 the last time she saw him. Today, they expressed a common reaction. They were proud.
I was very proud of him. That was my first reaction. I guess that's what I expected to see of a man who dedicated all his life to a particular cause and ideals. And he set these ideals as his goals, and he pursued them to the point of giving up 17, maybe 20 years of his life.
He's a man that his ideas and everything, we feel so proud of him.
Are you confident you'll be able to see him soon?
Yes, I am.
And you?
I'm extremely proud of my father. I never expected anything less than what I've seen after 14 years not seeing him. I feel extremely proud. His cause has been fantastic, and I believe I'll see him here very soon.
He looked very different. A lot of years has gone by, but that's important that he's still alive and that I'm gonna see him soon, I know.
The Martinezes and the Granados share their anguish with 3,000 other Cuban families whose relatives remain behind bars because of their political convictions. Now, however, hopes for their long-awaited reunion have been renewed. Bill Urbizu, Newswatch 10.
Explains from the nation's capital.
The news conference was supposed to clarify and widen Fidel Castro's recent and unprecedented invitation to exiles to participate in negotiations and discussions on issues as the release of 3,000 political prisoners and the reunification of Cuban families. Ramon Santiago, the head of the section in Washington, told reporters today the arrival of 48 political prisoners in Miami 2 weeks ago should be interpreted by the exile community as a show of good faith consideration to them. He said he hopes exiles will soon unite and form a representative delegation to travel to Havana and Castro. While delegates will not be required to sympathize with the revolution, he emphasized no terrorists or counter-revolutionaries would be allowed to partake. And since the problems to be discussed are the internal affairs of Cuba, no outsiders, particularly the U.S. government, will be given access. But only renewed Castralization of talk. The dialogue, he warned, is the only way all of these problems will be resolved.
The issues that will be discussed in this dialogue will be those regarding the concern for the people who are presently serving sentences in Cuba, the reunification of families, and the possibilities of transfer and visits to Cuba by Cuban citizens or of Cubans' origin living presently abroad. But these problems have not been yet decided. There's no solution yet, no decision taken regarding these problems. The only way in which these issues could solve will be through this dialogue with representatives of the Cuban community and the Cuban government. It would be the only way in which we could address the problem and find solutions for them.
He added, several more lists containing the names of hundreds of recently freed political prisoners who wish to come to the United States have been handed over to the State Department. Our aim, he said, is to end 20 years of hostilities
and separation.
Castro's open invitation to negotiate with representatives of the Cuban exile community has been extended again. Diplomats here say the talks could begin immediately. Without, they warn that problems of Cuban workers and the reunification of families will persist without solutions. Fidel Castro, Newswatch at Cuban Intercession, Washington.